Welcome back to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink. Tuesday, September 12th. Took the week off. Last week it was a little bit slower in terms of the IU news, but this week, fresh off of some recruiting visits and also just looking forward to the season beginning. Wanted to have Ryan Phillips of the Big Lead and Assembly Call back on the show. Looked at the calendar. It had been since January since we talked to you on the show, Ryan, which believe it or not, it was after a surprise blowout Indiana win at Illinois last year that you came on the show, which I think when I scheduled that show, we were probably both thinking we were going to be talking about another Indiana road loss, and they come out and win that game. So that's how long it's been. But welcome back to the show, Ryan. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Scheduling me, I guess, is just good luck. I don't know. But I can't believe it's since January. That does not seem like it was that long ago. I remember I was not at home and sat down and did that interview, and man, that was a long time ago.
You were out east, I think, right?
I was in Connecticut visiting my sister's family, so I found a room to do it in, and it was but yeah, I think back, I've been there a couple times since then, so I was just assuming it had been one of the more recent trips, but yeah, that was all the way back in January.
So the off season continues to kind of slog along here, but we've got a little less than 2 months until the regular season tips off. I want to ask you a loaded question here to start. We won't shy away from that. But what's your biggest question right now about Indiana basketball entering the third year of Mike Woodson's tenure?
It's interesting because I actually thought about this, and I'm glad you're diving right in. I appreciate that. But you know what it is? This is on a pure talent level. This is one of the most talented teams Indiana's had in a long time. If you look at, max potential of everybody, how does that talent translate is what I want to know. You've got Kelo Ware, a guy who was projected as a lottery pick, goes to Oregon and kind of tanks it, despite all the talent. And I know there's a lot of personal stuff going on for him that might have caused that. Does he become the player he was supposed to be? If he does, changes the projections of this season. Mbako comes in, 5-star freshman stud. What's the transition for him like? Does he reach his potential? Is he a one and done type because he has a great year, or is he a guy who, well, it's a rocky transition playing the wing and all that stuff? Probably playing the wing more, I would say. That kind of stuff there's so many questions. And so I think my one concern is just how quickly can those guys translate their talent into production, and can they? That's number one for me. And I would say a secondary one is just which Xavier Johnson are we going to get after essentially a year off? And I'd assume more good than bad, but or more good than, say average. But that's a big concern because there's going to be so much on his shoulders running the show for this team. It's not a situation where he has Jalen Hood-Schifino that they could just, hand off to and let him run it sometimes. There's a significant drop to the next ball handler. So yeah, just that talent into production timeline, and can the staff get the best out of these guys is my big question mark.
How sold are you on Xavier Johnson as a top level point guard within the Big Ten? We're doing right now our list with Hoops of the top 25 Big Ten players. I think there was a little bit of surprise, maybe pushback from some Indiana fans today when we had Xavier Johnson at 16 on the list. That's right about where Dylan and I both had him, which to me is about, fringe, third team, all Big Ten, and admittedly, when you look at these things this year, I think after about the top 5 or 6 players down to about the 35th best player, there's not a ton of separation. Yeah. I think you could make an argument for a lot of guys, but I think it's a big deal for Indiana which Xavier Johnson shows up consistently, because you look at what they lost last season. He's going to have to score more, first off, and he's also going to have to be consistently, it's kind of like the good Troy, bad Troy thing with Troy Williams. It's going to have to be more the good Xavier Johnson than the bad Xavier Johnson, because you look at his numbers last year, 2 Big Ten games he played, in early December. He had 13 turnovers and 12 points.
Yeah, and I do think Xavier to some degree struggled with the, how do I put this, with the sharing the ball situation with Jalen Hood-Schifino, where I think at the end of his first year at Indiana, they just gave the ball to him and let him go make plays. Whereas I felt like last year when he was in there, Jalen was in there as well a lot, and they were kind of, he was handing the ball, he was playing off the ball a little bit, and then when he did have the ball in his hands, I think it just wasn't as clean as we had seen in the second half of his first year at Indiana, of the 2021-22 season. I thought he was phenomenal at the end of the, in 2022 as they made that run to the NCAA tournament. You're right, though. There was a lot. I mean, if you took the first half of the season and everybody's opinions of him, it would have been that Troy Williams, good Troy, bad Troy thing. People were just like, what is this guy doing? And he wasn't super. He would showed some immaturity on the court and things like that. So yeah, we really need to see, for Indiana to be successful, we really need to see that second half of the 2021-22 season, Xavier Johnson. If you and that's the guy, as you said, when you're ranking him, he's an all Big Ten player. I would say, going into last year, I think a lot of people thought Indiana might have had the best point guard in the Big Ten or close to it because we had that recent memory of how that season ended. He didn't start off the season well last year. You look at his percentages and things like shooting percentage and 3-point percentage, free throw percentage, like that stuff stayed relatively the same, but it just, the turnover, you're right. There were a lot of turnovers that felt careless and silly, and also just felt like he wasn't as involved as it felt he was. He was running the show, the year before, and it felt like last year it was kind of, all right, we got some other guys who can help. And so that'll be interesting. I think that is another, if the young guys are probably the biggest X factor, and Xavier Johnson will be next on that list. What do you get out of him?
Yeah, in fairness to him too, he was also still trying to figure things out, I think, with Jalen Hood-Schifino before he got hurt. I mean, he had that game early in the season where he was excellent at Xavier that Indiana won. But I think they won that game. Yeah, exactly. And then also they don't make the tournament the year before without the way he played in the Big Ten tournament. So that's kind of what I'm kind of getting at. If he can be that player, then it's no doubt that he's a top 15, top 10 player in the Big Ten. But if he's more inconsistent, then I think the argument becomes a little bit more difficult to rank him that high. So that was just an interesting thing, to point out is just the
wide variety of outcomes that are possible.
Yeah, there's a lot of, the talent with him has never been a question. I mean, this is a guy that was on the all freshman team in the ACC his first year. I think that was actually the first year that was the only year that Zion Williamson was at Duke. So that's how how long Xavier Johnson's been in college. This is his sixth year. I mean, in terms of experience, he's done and seen it all. But I really just think Mike Woodson's got to be hoping that he's going to be a more mature, seasoned veteran player and kind of lead these young guys, because Indiana desperately needs it. And when you look behind him on the depth chart, there's not a lot there in terms of point guard play. I mean, obviously Gabe Cupps is somebody that has played the position and is going to come in and I think provide at least a serviceable backup at times. But I think Indiana is going to need Xavier Johnson to play 32, 34 minutes a game consistently, high level basketball to be successful.
Yeah, I would. That would not surprise me if he had to play that much. I think Gabe Cupps can be a really nice player at Indiana. And I know he's strong for the way his body is built. I know he's strong and he does really well in the weight room and all of that. But there's just guys with his body type tend to have a little bit of a struggle adapting to the physicality of college basketball, particularly in the Big Ten. So while I'm not saying he can't have a great freshman season, relying on that, like, oh, well, at least we got Gabe Cupps, he can pick up all of the slack, is foolish. I mean, if he does great, amazing, it's a bonus. But you're relying heavily on Xavier Johnson to carry things for you.
One guy that is, I think, also pivotal in Indiana's season is Malik Reneau, who we saw at times last year. He too, that game at Xavier, 12 points and 6 rebounds, comes off the bench, plays really well, but struggled for most of the season to stay on the court because of foul issues. Mm-hmm. When you watched him last season, what did you attribute that to? Was it just it almost seemed like after it happened a couple of games, it was like a snowball rolling downhill, like it was going to happen consistently. Like he couldn't get out of the rut of fouling so much. I think he had almost, I'm not looking at Ken Palm right now, but I think it was like 6.8 fouls per 40 minutes, which is a very high rate, obviously, a rate that's not sustainable if you want to play, you know, 25, 30 minutes a game, like I believe he aspires to do this season. You know, what did you see with him in terms of the fouling last year? And do you think that's something that he's going to be able to easily correct going into his second year?
There's one person in your audience who'll get this reference. It was a Travis Knight level of fouling. I mean, it was just like, you know, it was he would just come out and just get your fouls all out of the way. You're done. I think part of it was the one thing about Malik is he came in and I don't think his body was where he wanted it to be, and he looks great now. But I think that, you know, he's sort of late to the party, late to the workout program, and he was a freshman, and I don't think his lateral quickness was where it needed to be. And I think that was a big part of it, is he would get a step on him and he'd use his arm to stop him. And because most of his fouls, it felt, came off the dribble, as opposed to going for a rebound or blocking a shot or whatever. Those are going to happen, and those happen to everybody. But if you can't keep a guy in front of you and you can't, you know, position yourself properly and move quickly enough, you're going to get behind and you're going to foul. And I felt like that was a lot of what happened to him. Then plus that, you get a reputation. When you foul a lot, officials are looking for it a lot more. And so I think you're right about the snowball effect. Is there were times I remember watching, it was like, he didn't do anything there, but he got the call because that's what people expect of him, is to get that. So yeah, Malik Reneau is incredibly important to this team. I think the fact that he will be a starter, officials will have more of a reluctance to call quick fouls on him. I think that's just the way things go. But yeah, if you look back, I mean, against Purdue, he played 10 minutes and had 4 fouls. Like, I mean, it's just Maryland, he fouled out in 13 minutes. Like, I'm looking at it right now. It's staggering. And but that has to change. I mean, he has to be on the floor. I think his offense in the post is going to be so valuable to this team, because I think he's an elite post offensive guy. I love his moves. I love his footwork. I love what he can do down there. He's a great rebounder. He didn't get to shine as much because the guy in front of him was, you know, at everything all-time great at Indiana, Trace Jackson Davis, but I think he's got that potential to be a really outstanding post player in the Big Ten.
I think we're all assuming that Indiana is going to start Mbako, Ware, and Reneau together. I guess a two-part question. Do you agree with that? And do you think that works, you know, on a night in, night out basis in the Big Ten? Because there's some guys in the Big Ten, just kind of looking around the league, that are going to play the 3 or even the 4, that are pretty mobile and like to get on the floor and shoot 3. So I just wonder, I mean, obviously you kind of have to look at it from an offensive and defensive perspective. Offensively, yeah, maybe you exploit some matchups, but defensively, you know, is Mbako going to be able to chase around Peyton Sanford on Iowa and contest, you know, 9 or 10 3-point attempts a game? I just kind of wonder from a defensive perspective how it works. So it's curious to get your thoughts on that.
It's a fair question. We've discussed this on Assembly Call, sort of, how are you going to do this? And I think those 3 guys will start. If I had to assume today, yes, I think what I would like to see from Indiana is more flexibility in the starting lineup. Just because you start guys one game doesn't mean you have to start them the next game, and adjust your lineup based on matchups. And I know the starting lineup, I know people get caught up in it. It doesn't matter that much really in the end. Who plays the most is what matters. And right. So I do think we all kind of get caught up in that, because there is a cachet to starting. Players want to start. It's, you know, it's a thing. But I'd rather finish the game than start it. So I do think those guys will start. I think Indiana will have a tremendous length and size advantage on a lot of the teams it plays. But the way that's going to fit, we'll see. I mean, we haven't seen these guys on the floor really. You know what I like? Mbako, how's he going to look transitioning? He's had a whole summer in a conditioning program. Where is he going to be a different player than he was at Oregon? We're assuming so. Can he play on the perimeter more? Can he move? Can he use his length to hold in a guy like Peyton Sanford? You know, and maybe he can't keep with him quickness wise, but his length is going to be tough to shoot over. Like, can there be that Swiss Army knife kind of thing? with all of those guys where they can do those things. And honestly, I do tell people, we get caught up in preseason rankings and things like that. It's like nobody knows. We'll see. I mean, the team probably has some kind of idea, but we haven't seen these guys before. It's not like last year where everybody coming in, we're like, okay, you've seen this guy, you can project what Trace Jackson Davis is going to do, project Xavier Johnson, Trey Galloway, whatever. A large chunk of Indiana's roster we haven't seen play college basketball, really. I mean, Ware, again, you can pretty much wipe last year off the map for Khalil Ware. What's he going to be? What's M'Baku going to be? How's Reneau going to look playing instead of 10 minutes a game, playing 25? So it really is one of those things where I tell people, just like when you read these preview magazines that rank Indiana 8th in the Big Ten or 4th in the Big Ten or whatever, it's a guess. You have no idea what's going to happen. So, I'm excited to see what that level of athleticism and length looks like on a front line for Indiana, but also cautiously, approaching it because you don't know what's going to be like.
Yeah, the other thing I don't know that we're going to have a firm grasp on what this team actually is until maybe early January, mid-January, because the schedule is such that you're putting all these new pieces together and then you're going to come out, I think it's the fourth game of the season, and play UConn. You're also going to play Kansas at home. You're going to play Auburn, who in the latest bracketology that I saw talk about a prediction that we don't know anything about at this point, but Lenardi's got a bracketology out. He's got Auburn in the tournament as a 7 seed, which is higher than Indiana. He's also got them playing two teams, and he is also going to play Wright State and Morehead State, who are from smaller conferences, but projected to make the tournament. I mean, there's the schedule this season.
It's a big schedule, yeah.
It's not like one of those seasons where they're playing like 5 Ken Palm sub 300 teams, like back in, remember the Tom Crean days where there would be those schedules. These are like, I was looking at Bart Torvik's ranking. A lot of these teams are like between like 150 and 200. Like these are teams that are actually competent basketball teams that are going to be able to give Indiana problems, especially if they're not ready to play. So, I think early in the season, this team might take some losses, and you hope by the time Big Ten schedule rolls around that they're going to be a much different team. But I think when you're only returning, I think it's like 25-30% of your scoring, you're trying to put all these new faces together. I applaud Mike Woodson for being so ambitious with the non-conference schedule. I think a lot of people are happy to see this, but I just don't know that with a team that trying to put all these new faces together, it's going to go maybe as well as people think, at least early in the season, playing that level of a schedule. I mean, UConn, that's no joke. In MSG to start the season.
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
And then you get Louisville or Texas after that. It's I would say, fans complained about the schedule for years, and understandably. And I would say be careful what you wish for to some degree. I think it's going to be fun to watch Indiana match up against these great programs. But I think you're right. When I say this,
not to interrupt you, but even going back to last year, like they had a really good team and they played Kansas and Arizona and they were totally outmatched. But in those games, and people thought, the season was over, and then obviously Indiana turned it around. But I think you could see some of those type of situations this year.
I completely agree. And it could be worse this year too. I think that they have, again, as I keep harping on this, they have the talent level of some of those teams, but again, they haven't done it in college basketball yet. They haven't, and they're just going to be getting on the floor together. I would say I tend to tell people every year, like, wait till January to make your assessments on every team, because you'll see a team go win the Maui Invitational and then fall off a cliff in January. It be the toast of college basketball, and then mid-season just be falling apart. It's let them go through some wars before you start to predict what they'll be. And you got to remember, in general, the conference season is what matters. If you get a win early, it helps you. It's great. Those losses to good teams early don't tend to hurt you. They're obviously a huge bonus if you win one. The only thing that matters is don't lose to a lower tier school. Essentially, is all you have to do before the conference season is do not collapse against a bad team that's going to hurt you in the long run, but do well in conference. And so if the team uses that as a building block, even if they come out of it with a number of losses, if they enter conference season and have gelled and gotten better, that's probably a huge bonus that they played some tough teams. But yeah, I would say it could be a rough, month and a half, 2 months to start the season with all those new pieces trying to fit in and figure out their roles.
One of the reasons I wanted to have you on this week, Ryan, was to talk to you about the Big Ten's expansion westward, which I admittedly am not the biggest fan of. You are out in beautiful San Diego. You're very familiar with these 4 programs that are going to be coming into the Big Ten next season. This is all being done, let's make no mistake about it, because of football. Basketball is low on the priority list in figuring this out. But as I start to think ahead to next basketball season, we're going to have 18 teams in the Big Ten. There's already been some reporting, although it was walked back a little bit by Nicole Auerbach of The Athletic, that the Big Ten doesn't plan to expand the basketball schedule beyond 20 games, which to me, if you have 18 teams and you're trying to determine a regular season champion and only playing 20 games, I don't know how you do that very well. What do you make of? I know this is all being done from a football perspective, but what do you make of the basketball impact on this move? I mean, obviously it's going to make the conference stronger because you're adding some really good programs, but is the product actually going to be better with all of this travel and a more, just kind of, I don't want to say diluted schedule, but you can have if they're going to stay at 20 games and there's 18 teams, unless my math's wrong, you're going to have like something like 14 single plays and 3 double plays every year. I mean, I just don't know how we're going to get a good regular season Big Ten product out of this.
First of all, let me just say, all of this is stupid. Like the coverage it's just, I get it's all for money. That's all it is. There's no logic to it. Stanford and Cal just joined the Atlantic Coast Conference.
And SMU that bought its way in, basically.
Yeah. Stanford and Cal are a stone's throw from the Pacific Ocean, not the Atlantic. Right. It's just, the whole thing is dumb. I honestly thought the Big Ten should have absorbed Stanford and Cal and just made like a West Coast wing of the conference of 6 teams, and then add Nebraska and Minnesota, make it 8 or something. I don't know, but it doesn't seem to be following any logic. I understand why the Big Ten wanted to expand to LA, gives you a big market. I don't really understand the addition of Oregon. I don't think they offer a whole lot other than Nike money, but that doesn't go to the other schools. So I didn't understand that. I don't understand Washington gives you Seattle. But yeah, this whole thing, I just think it's silly, and I think the product will suffer. I think that'll be the big problem, but nobody cares if the basketball product suffers. They want the football product, and I think the football product will suffer too. You've got teams that are going to be flying across the country every other week to play games, as opposed to, going 200 miles. They're going 2,000 now, and that takes a toll on kids. And, we're expanding the schedules. They outplay, college football teams can now play 15 games, something like that. With basketball, look, I know a lot of people were really excited when the Big Ten expanded because everybody gets more money, and a lot of fans I talked to were like, "Oh, this is great! We're gonna get a big contract, and each school's gonna have more money." I was like, "Be careful what you wish for here, because you're adding good programs that are also going to get a lot of money, and it's going to make it tougher for you to make it where you want to go." And the other thing, and this is going to come up, and I know they're going to start suggesting this within the next year, is they're going to try. These big conferences that now have all the power are going to try to bully their way into an all at-large bid NCAA tournament instead of doing the conference champion automatic bids, which means they're trying to get more of their teams in the NCAA tournament versus the small conference teams, which again means you're going to get fewer of those Cinderella type stories that everybody loves. And I think the magic of the tournament happens in those first 2 games, where in those first 4, that first weekend, where you've got tiny teams playing the big boys and going toe to toe with them, and often, pulling off upsets and stuff like that. That's what everybody loves to watch. And they're going to try and muscle that out because they think the people who run these conferences are so out of touch with what actual people want to watch and want to and are looking for, they think that people want more top level teams in the tournament, which is not the case. We want because the thing is, by the end of the tournament, the better teams have weeded themselves. All that stuff gets weeded out. The Final Four typically looks like you thought you would expect it, maybe with one exception. So the cream does rise to the top usually, but that first weekend is why people watch. And if you're weeding that out, you just get the NBA playoffs. I feel like, and that you lose the magic. And but again, the people who run these conferences, they are not in touch with what actual people want. I don't think anybody wants to see USC or wants to see Oregon in the Big Ten. Nobody cares about, if on the Big Ten fans don't really care about Oregon or Washington. I think USC being in football because of the history there, seeing them play Ohio State or Michigan or whatever, it'll look good on the field. But I mean, nobody in that I know. I grew up and out here, went to USC for a year, then transferred to Indiana. But I know people in the Midwest. Nobody cares about USC football in the Midwest. So it's not like these are things being put together because people are asking for it. It's all how can we grab the most money? And I do think, as you said, I think the product's really going to suffer. I don't know how they're going to do a schedule with 18 teams, as you said too. It's going to be a lot of maneuvering. How are they going to do, when a team has to play, are they just going to pair up Washington and Oregon? And so a team will fly to Oregon, play them and then just stick around and then go to Washington? Or how, are they just going to go out to LA and stay for 5 days and play both teams? Yeah. The people who suffer in this are the student athletes. And I know they're getting paid now and all of that, and more money, more exposure is good for them. But they're the ones who are going to have to sit on those planes and travel and, spend so much time away. And also their parents who, a lot of the complaints I'm hearing out here is, parents can't drive to their kids, all their games anymore. They gotta fly all the way across the country. So yeah, that was my long rant on what's going on in college basketball and college football.
Yeah. And I think it negatively impacts the four schools that are entering the league the worst, because think about it. Let's say Indiana plays, let's say every year they're going to play two of the West Coast schools. Well, they could probably knock that out in one trip, right? But the schools like Oregon and Washington, UCLA, USC, they can only play each other so many times, and they're going to have to come to a completely different part of the country for a significant portion of their schedule. So we're not talking about just one trip where, Rutgers may just go west once, and that's obviously an inconvenience, but it's not a huge inconvenience. But if USC basketball has to come to the East Coast 3 or 4 times a year, that's not easy travel. I mean, I know these kids take, private, airplanes and all that now, and the travel isn't much better than what it used to be, but it's still not ideal when you're doing that to your body and trying to recover and then come home. And we know these schedules. Sometimes there's really tough turnarounds. You could play a Monday game and then on the road, and then all of a sudden you're back Thursday night playing at home. I mean, I just and the other thing I wonder about, I think there needs to be more conference games, but if you do that, then all of a sudden are all these other non-conference marquee games off the table at that point? Because if you say you're going to
start scheduling like the SEC in football,
you're going to go to 24. Say you go to 24 Big Ten conference games, and there's 7 non-conference games. Do you think Indiana's then going to play UConn, Auburn, and Kansas? No, they're going to play 7 games that they can for sure win, because they know that they're going to have to play 24 conference games. So the whole thing to me is just, it's very I don't know.
It's all short-sighted for money. It really is. And here's the thing about the travel, and we keep mentioning the travel. The reason why the travel is tough is it leads to guys being really tired. And when guys are tired, they get hurt. The number one cause of injury almost always is guys being tired and worn down and making a wrong step or doing something they wouldn't normally do, gets them hurt. Sometimes there's freak stuff where you just land weird or whatever. But being tired is what causes injuries, and these kids are going to be exhausted. I mean, flying from LA to Rutgers, let's say, then flying all the way back, and then you're gonna have to fly to Penn State, and it's crazy, and it's gonna take a toll. And I think it's really gonna hurt those teams. I don't think it's a logical move for them. So
it's less impactful in football too, because you're just playing once a week, right? So
yes,
you may play every other week on the road. Well, you can maybe adjust the travel a little bit, so you get there a couple days earlier than maybe you normally would, and give your body a chance to rest. But basketball, you can't do that. I mean, these are 2 or 3 games a week, and you've got school to consider in there. Which, I mean, I know a lot of these guys probably take classes online and aren't actually going to in-person classes at all times. But and there's tutors and all those resources. But it's still, I mean, I just it's never going back to this, and maybe this is just me. Kind of reminiscing on the good old days of the Big Ten, but it sure was nice to have a conference where everyone was kind of in it within the earshot of each other, and
it was regional,
kind of playing regional, right?
Yeah,
the games mattered.
Yeah, and I think that really started to go away when the Big Ten brought in Maryland and Rutgers. At that point, it didn't make sense. It didn't make sense. Bringing in Nebraska, okay, they kind of had a Big Ten feel to them. Penn State obviously was, but once you brought in Rutgers and Maryland, I think it gave the green light to every conference to be like, okay, we don't have to be regional. We can just go take whoever we want and figure it out later. And I think that it's all based on TV viewership, TV contracts, all of that. There's no consideration given to basic logic. I mean, that's just out the window. What's that? So yeah, I think it's going to be fascinating. I think we're rapidly heading to a world where there are basically 2 big conferences and everybody else is left without a chair as the music stops.
Last thing I wanted to ask you about before we let you go. Indiana's 2024 recruiting obviously is a big topic on everybody's mind right now with, they had official visits with Derek Queen and Liam McNeely, Curtis Givens the third over the weekend. They're in the mix with Boogie Flan. Obviously, in this 2024 class, Indiana is kind of aimed a little bit higher in terms of the rankings. They're going after the best of the best. And one thing I think that's what happens there. It's not that I'm skeptical that Indiana can land some of these kids, because they've already done it under Mike Woodson, Jalen Hood-Schifino, Malik Reneau, Tamar Bates, Mackenzie Mbako, the list goes on. But these are these are longer term recruitments that, Indiana hasn't necessarily had the same track record in yet under Mike Woodson. And I wonder just kind of how you would constitute success with this recruiting cycle. Does Indiana need to sign at least like 2 of these guys that they're targeting by November? Is it not as big of a deal if they don't, because they have the portal still for them in the spring? All summer, it felt like the traditional recruiting cycle of like summer recruiting and who coaches were watching. It wasn't as big of a deal as it usually was because of the portal. But now, as we've gotten to the fall and Indiana doesn't have any kids signed for 2024, I think people are starting to kind of wonder what's going to happen there. I'm just curious what you think Indiana needs to do here to make this like deemed a success when signing day gets here.
Yeah, they went all in on a couple guys, and they I'll say this: they did get in the conversation for a ton of people, which is good. You want to be in the conversation. The problem is if they strike out, it's going to be a huge problem. Yes, the portal exists, but you are gambling that certain guys will be available that fit your needs. I think, and you'll likely find somebody, but are they somebody that you really want to this level? When you're looking at 5-star freshmen as opposed to a guy from the portal who probably, isn't on the same level. And there are also those guys now with the portal who spring open and like we saw with Mbako. Yeah, I think they need to get a couple of these guys. I think it would be a great sign as a program if they're like, hey, look, we can close a long recruitment. We haven't done it yet, but we can close a long recruitment. And a guy like McNeely, every indication I was given was that Indiana had a pretty significant lead heading into his official visit, but I know he went to Kansas, and I know that Kansas is pushing very, very hard for him as well. They're kind of late to the recruitment, but when you're Bill Self, you can do that. When you have the track record he has, and when you have the program he has, you can do that. Queen, they do need a post player. Getting Queen would be huge as well. They went after several in this cycle, but he's a guy that I think they need to get at this point. Now look, as we talked about before we went on the air, I mean, if you aim high, you're going to strike out a lot because there's only so many of those elite players for a ton of teams that are going after them. But Indiana needs to prove under Mike Woodson they can close some of these long recruitments. And even just getting one of them would be like, okay, take a deep breath, everybody. But the fact that we are now in September and like mid-September and they don't have a single commitment for 2024, that's a little concerning at this point. I thought they needed a commitment over the summer, regardless of who it came from. They needed something to show some momentum in that way. Doesn't mean this is going to end badly. It just is kind of, you're at the point where you're like, all right, starting to put the radar up and be a little concerned. And they need to close some of these guys and they need to get a class together for next year. And we'll see how it goes. There's a reason. I think Indiana fans are right to be a little nervous at this point. Doesn't mean it's going to end up bad, but I think they're right to be a little nervous.
Ryan, it's always good to catch up with you. Thanks for the time. We'll continue to read your work over at the Big Lead, and we'll look forward to your rants coming up this season on the Assembly Call. I'm sure there'll be plenty.
I'm available to you anytime, Alex. You know that.
Thanks again to Ryan Phillips for joining us on this week's episode of Podcast on the Brink. If you enjoyed the show, please leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. Leave us a rating on Spotify, and we'll be back soon with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.